Okay. Wait, so it says recording. I haven't actually clicked anything. Have I?
Is this just going to be audio or video as well?
It's recording.
Should be
Record
both.
button is on.
Well, that's me recording.
It's you recording. Okay, I can record on this computer. Okay. All right. So hello, everyone. And welcome to the Free Speech in the Left panel presented by the Boston College chapter of Platypus. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the 1920s to 30s Old Left, the 1960s to 70s New Left, and the 1980s to 90s post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The Platypus Student Club at Boston College runs a weekly reading group on the history of the left, also weekly coffee breaks and intermittent public events like this. If you'd like to be included on our emailing list or get involved in our activities, please sign up at the following link, which I will drop in the chat box. You can also find the Platypus Review, our forum and print, currently mostly all online, at platypus1917.org. Now to introduce our panelists in the order they'll be speaking. First, Eric Thomas Chester is an activist, former econ professor, including at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a member of the Socialist Party USA, for which he was the candidate for vice president in 1996 and ran twice for Congress from Massachusetts, and is the author of several books, including Free Speech and the Suppression of Dissent During World War I. He currently lives in Glasgow, Scotland, so we're very thankful for him to join us in this evening hour.
Good.
Ben Burgis is a philosophy professor at Georgia State University in Atlanta, the host of the podcast Give Them an Argument, and the author of the recent book Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left.
Thanks, Will.
Carl Davidson is the national co-chair of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, the author of several books, and a former writer and news editor for the National Guardian newspaper. Carl was a leader in the New Left student movement in the 1960s, serving as vice president and national secretary of Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. And finally, Ed Remus is a longtime member of Platypus and works at Northeastern Illinois University as a social science librarian and assistant professor. So the way this panel will work is that we're going to give each panelist 10 minutes to give their opening remarks. And to the four panelists, I will signal with these obtrusive signs. Hopefully it shows up with the video. Maybe it's not. It's not really showing up, is it?
Oh, no, not at all.
Not at all. That's all right. I can just be vocally.
I mean, I guess I could see a little bit under it. So from
you can know that I'm doing something. No, I'll just
make a T. You know.
Make a T. I'll try to interrupt, not to well, interrupting is interrupting. So I'll try to let you know when we're running out of time. So try to keep it around 10 minutes. And we'll follow this opening remark round with a quick response around 3 minutes where you can respond to each other's opening remarks. And then we'll open up to a Q&A with the audience, where the audience can ask questions either by raising their hand or voicing it out loud. And we definitely do encourage, those are the same thing, by raising your hand in Zoom and speaking out loud, or doing the chat box, the Q&A box, in which case I can read it out loud. But we do encourage speaking out loud so we can unmute you and have you speak on Zoom. So now for the panel description for today's panel, entitled Free Speech in the Left. Historically, the left believed the more speech, the better, and that the state should regulate it as little as possible. Recently, the left has become ambivalent about the First Amendment, of which it fears the right may be taking better advantage. The storming of the US Capitol on January 6 has exacerbated many of these fears, provoking widespread support for the ensuing censorship campaign in the name of law and order, including the Washington Post celebrating the Sedition Act of 1798 that criminalized defamation of government. Yet, calls to clamp down on right-wing speech possibly strengthen the same initiatives that the capitalist state uses to suppress the left. Infamously, Woodrow Wilson's Democratic Party regime convicted Socialist Party presidential candidate Eugene Debs of sedition and imprisoned him for criticizing America's participation in World War I. Since the January 6 events of this year, social media corporations with no democratic oversight have silenced accounts on both the right and the left, with Facebook purging leftist pages like the World Socialist website. Yet, conservative outlets have led the charge on criticizing these measures. Have civil liberties become a right-wing idea? Is the state's censorship of critics a serious threat? In the face of the left's historic commitment to civil liberties, how should the left approach free speech and the right to protest today? So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Eric Chester for opening remarks.
Okay, well, from my point of view, free speech and the right to peacefully protest are essential freedoms that are necessary for any kind of democratic society to be real, to be genuine. Without those, it's a farce, it's a mockery. And for free speech to mean something, it means that all ideas have to be allowed, permitted. They're all part of the public discourse. That's important. And part of it is, Will mentioned, if you start putting restrictions on right-wing thought, it'll boomerang immediately and quickly onto the left. That's the historical record. But it's more than that. When we start to talk about a future society, we want to project a society that's more democratic than this one, not less. There's more input, more vigorous discussion going on. And the only way we can make that real now is by defending free speech right now for everybody, for everybody. Free speech, if it means anything, is for everybody. So that's where I start from. And I should say one more point about sort of prefigurative politics. It's important for the left to make clear its commitment to free speech, because unfortunately, in the minds of many people who are not sophisticated political people, socialism has become associated with authoritarian regimes, most extreme being Stalin's Russia. So we want to state very clearly that we're for a new society which is more democratic, not less democratic, and we defend the free speech now as part of that. So I was interested in looking at the government's repression of the left during World War I. It was a very different kind of period than we have now. The left was quite strong. You had the Socialist Party, the IWW. The left presented a genuine challenge to the powers that be, so that when Woodrow Wilson clamped down on dissent, he wasn't being paranoid. It was a real threat to him. Not that the revolution was going to happen the next day, no, but nonetheless, the organized left could mobilize a lot of people who were opposed to the war. The war was very unpopular, and that presented a real threat to what Wilson was trying to do. So my book covers a wide variety of topics, but I want to focus on the Debs case, which Will mentioned, a very important case. Gene Debs was a hugely popular figure at the time. In fact, somebody said the only person who was as popular, not more, as popular was Teddy Roosevelt, a terrible person, by the way, but he was also very popular. But Debs was a hugely popular person. So when the government went after Debs, it was saying to everybody, nobody is safe. If you step out of line, you can wind up in a federal prison. Debs gave a lengthy speech in Canton, Ohio in June 1918, most of it which was not about the war, but there was part of it was about the war. And in the process, he referred to US soldiers as cannon fodder. Now, I'm sure many parents of soldiers who were dying on the Western Front found that offensive. He was saying they were dupes. They were being used. They weren't really fighting for democracy. They were fighting for U.S. imperialism. And from my point of view, he had every right to say that, but we should be clear. If we go down the road that says you can't make talks, can't present speeches that are offensive to somebody, you're going down a very dangerous road. Debs wound up in jail in part for that. And by the way, he actually, well, he was indicted for a whole range of things. The Supreme Court upheld the section that was not the Sedition Act, it was the Espionage Act. He was convicted of obstructing the war effort and the draft by making a speech in part that said that the soldiers were cannon fodder. So that's actually historically what happened. Now, one more point, this goes very much to what Will said. Debs, when he spoke out for free speech, which he did very vigorously in his defense during his trial, he did it from a point of view of confidence. He was sure that his ideas would appeal to the working class. And it was because of that that the government was clamping down on him. It seems to me that we need to have that same kind of confidence. We have to have the confidence in our ideas, that we have a program and a critique that will appeal to large numbers of people. That seems to me that the attitude we need to take, not to spend our time and effort trying to suppress those who we disagree with. That will go nowhere. In fact, it's bound to boomerang. And I think that's the kind of, to me, that was one of the important lessons reading about Debs and the Canton speech, was that when you read his speech to the jury, he's speaking as someone who is confident in his ideas, who believes that they have an appeal to a wide circle of people, to the working class in particular and beyond. And it's that kind of confidence that we need to have. And I think you're right. Well, Trump's election has shaken a lot of people, but it's not the right direction to go in. We have to present a program and a strategy and a vision of an alternative society that a lot of people will find appealing. Trying to clamp down on the right wing is the wrong way to go. So I am very much for free speech. I'm for I don't think that any idea per se is beyond bounds. That's not the right way to go. If you have an idea that's reprehensible, then counter it with another idea, not with state force or suppression. So I am an absolutist when it comes to free speech. And I hope that is the kind of politics that the left projects now.
Thank you, Eric. Next, let's turn to Ben.
Yeah, so I think that at the beginning, Eric made some of the distinctions that I would want to make, and some of the the points that I'd want to set up with. So I'm going to see if I can build on that a little bit, and also maybe dig a little bit more into what I think of as the theoretical foundations of left support for free speech, since it's something that I do think is very important to recover. It's certainly not true that that the left has by any means entirely abandoned it. I mean, I point out, for example, that the Jacobin has run very vigorous defenses of important principles about free speech. I've written some of them, so so that there are definitely loud voices on the left who have good views about this, but there is no doubt that there has been some backing away from it in some quarters. I mean, I think I started to notice and worry about this a couple of years ago when I would start to see people who, in many cases shared a lot of my political commitments, or were at the very least somewhere in the muddy gray area between my political commitments and something a little bit, softer and more liberal than that, who would respond to concerns about free speech by, making jokes about frozen peaches. And that made me think that something was getting lost. I'd see a sort of knee-jerk response in some quarters that any sort of concern about free speech was, or anybody's speech being suppressed, certainly by corporate sort of social media platforms, for example, or that free speech is just an important value that we should be talked about, treated as unserious or disingenuous preoccupation of bad faith actors. And I think it is important to make clear why, as Eric says, that's not the right way to go, and why historically the left, which I mean, I also can't claim that just like I don't think everybody now is wrong about it. I certainly can't claim that historically everyone was right about it. Right? The left is a category that has included Stalinists, for example, but but that the best of the left has historically cared so much about this, whether we're talking about the Wobblies doing what they would call free speech fights, and when some like local sheriff would try to run an organizer out of town, to the free speech movement that helped give Berkeley, that helped give rise to the New Left, and many other examples, and I think that in trying to show why this is an important concern and one that should be central to the left, I think that there are a couple of distinctions that need to be made. Eric already kind of gestured at one of them about free speech as a strategic imperative right now, when most likely the censors, either state or corporate, are not going to be on our side, and free speech as a component of our vision of the kind of social society that we want. On the latter, I've always thought that one of the best defenses of it was Rosa Luxemburg's 1918 pamphlet on the Russian Revolution, where which she was very supportive of, but she was also worried that emergency measures become a habit, and she said in that pamphlet, responding to Trotsky, ironically, saying we have never been idol worshippers of formal democracy. That she says all that this is true, but all it means is we have always distinguished the social kernel from the political form of bourgeois democracy. We've always revealed the hard kernel of social inequality and lack of freedom hidden in the sweet shell of formal equality and freedom, not in order to reject the latter, but to spur the working class into not being satisfied with the shell, but rather by conquering political power to create a socialist democracy to replace bourgeois democracy, not to eliminate democracy altogether, which I think is exactly the right distinction. That, of course, formal protections of free speech are unsatisfying and should be unsatisfying in a society where some people could afford their own printing presses, and other people have to spend all day at work worrying that if they say the wrong thing, they'll lose their livelihood. But the answer is a more robust version of free speech that we can have under socialism, rather than less. Another distinction that I think is important to make is between free speech at the level of the state, what the government can do to censor people, and free speech in a variety of other contexts, like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And even the ways that seeing value in free speech and open debate, having that confidence that Eric was talking about in our ideas, might inform how we think about issues that aren't strictly speaking free speech issues at all, like what the range of views are that you can express in a New York Times op-ed, for example. So I think about last summer when Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed in the New York Times calling for Trump to send the troops into the cities to shoot rioters, and that was very controversial. In fact, it was so controversial that they ran it, that led to enough discontent in the ranks that the editor who approved the op-ed had to step down about it. And in a context like that, I don't know that it goes as far as complete absolutism. I don't know that anybody, there's a sense in which maybe nobody would be. You probably couldn't publish an op-ed in the New York Times calling for the legalization of pedophilia, and I'm fine with that. But I think that it's particularly dangerous to err on the side of narrowing the parameters of allowable debate rather than erring on the side of broadening it. Both because, of course, that's ultimately going to be what's going to most benefit the left, since broad parameters are what give us a chance to make our case, and also because in cases like that, it's trying to suppress that kind of right-wing speech, it's a lost cause. It's at the time that Tom Cotton op-ed was written, there were polls showing, something like 56% of the American public agreed with him. So trying to just suppress the expression of the opinion so it would go away strikes me as a lost cause. What I thought would have been much better is if they had just run the op-ed and run another op-ed next to it with somebody vigorously disagreeing with it. And if we had the side-by-side Tom Cotton and Cornel West op-eds, I think that would probably be the best possible outcome. As far as the middle level, that sort of corporate deplatforming, where we're talking about what the rules should be for social media, for YouTube, etc. I think that oftentimes there I see a disturbing phenomenon whereby leftists sometimes start talking about that stuff and suddenly they stop being leftists. Suddenly they start being free market libertarians who think that it can only count as a suppression of freedom if the state does it, that private entities exercising private power can't constrict freedom, which if you believe that really undercuts the entire basis of socialism, since workers can't be being under capitalism, because they're not being legally coerced into working. They're just being compelled by economic circumstances. And there too, I think that when you're talking about absolutism, if that suggests that there can't be reasonable rules about harassment and incitement to violence and a few other issues, that's one thing. But saying that this can't be an issue about censorship, about speech, because it's a corporation doing it, is something that I think is at best a very odd fit with the worldview of the left. And we should be pushing for the most permissive, reasonable rules there. Last point, because I know I'm running up to the end of my 10 minutes. I think that when you talk about the kind of theoretical basis of caring about free speech, there are a couple of different possible arguments that you can make, and I actually think Marxists should make both of them. So one of them is kind of the classic Millian argument for free speech, which is that you're going to have better outcomes if you have a wide variety of different points of view that can be expressed, that we can't be confident the way we know the right answers, without having that kind of vigorous debate. And I think that's a reasonable argument. I think that's Rosa Luxemburg's argument essentially in that Russian Revolution pamphlet, that in order to build socialism, you're going to be confronted with all kinds of unexpected problems, and you can't assume, as she says, that a few dozen intellectuals behind their desks issuing orders are going to be able to have good solutions to all these problems. You need to be able to tap into the creativity of the great mass of the population, which you just can't if people are worried that they're going to be arrested for saying the wrong thing. And of course, people often push back against this by saying, well, there's no guarantee that the right ideas will win out, which is absolutely true. But my response would be that we have even less reason to be confident that any particular censorship regime, will lead to good consequences. And there's also a more Kantian kind of argument for free speech, that if you are treating people not just as means to an end, means to your ends, but as autonomous reasoning people who are due a certain sort of respect, then persuasion, giving them a chance to to express their views, and for you to try to convince them they're wrong, rather than simply trying to paternalistically save them from believing in wrong things, I think falls very naturally from that. And I would also argue that it's actually a very natural fit with the idea that as socialists, we want to fight for a society in which working people have far more autonomous decision-making control over their own lives, and that the kind of normative basis of that is giving everybody that kind of human dignity. So I think there are both Millian and Kantian reasons to care about free speech, and that both of them are actually a very natural fit with, again, what the socialist left has stood for, at least when it's been at its best.
Thank you, Ben. Next, we have Carl Davidson. Carl, you're muted.
Excuse me.
There we go. Thank you.
I was agreeing with most of the things that have been said. I think a place where I might be a little different is I'm a natural human rights guy. In other words, I think we have rights like free speech and so on because of who we are, because we're human beings. And government doesn't give us rights. It can try to suppress our rights and restrict them. But we have basic human rights because of who we are. And the expression of that can vary through history and come to different expressions at different times. It's expressed one way in our own constitution. The French Revolution expressed it another way. The UN has a slightly different take on it. And, so those things can evolve through history. But the idea that we have a core of human rights, I think, is part of our nature as human beings, and it's not given to us, it's not ceded to us by government. So that's sometimes seen as a conservative argument, or people characterize it in different ways, but it's one that makes sense to me. In terms of our own First Amendment, there's very interesting things when you read it. First of all, it only restricts Congress. It says a Congress should make no law. It doesn't say anything about state governments or local governments or private organizations or whatever. So for the long time, even though Congress made no law restricting speech, the state governments made all sorts of outrages against free speech, burning up abolitionist printing presses, shooting abolitionist editors, burning abolitionist newspapers, and so on. For a long time, we had horrendous suppression of free speech on the part of state government, which was allowed because up until the 14th Amendment, it only applied to the federal government, not to anywhere else. Even in the 14th Amendment, it didn't really get implemented until the Gitlow case in the World War I period, where they interpreted the 14th Amendment as applying as all the amendments of the Constitution, all federal rights were also imposed upon states. So that was a landmark decision, even though some of the decisions made, as Eric has talked about in that period, were piss poor. You take Oliver Wendell Holmes, for instance. He took the abstract analogy of firing a crowded theater and transformed it into what he called the clear and present danger exception. And that was continued to be able to be used to people like Debs or other socialists or radicals who were speaking as they were clear and present danger to law breaking or something like that. And so that, for that reason, their speech could be suppressed. Some of those things held up through the 1930s and into the 1940s with the Smith Act, where they got even worse, and the Communist Party was made, well, first the Socialist Workers' Party, and then the Communist Party was made illegal. But some of the Supreme Court decisions in the 1950s began to backtrack and to go further in a more libertarian direction than Oliver Wendell Holmes with his clear and present danger. They tried to narrow it. And finally, in 1969, in Brandenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court finally got it set an even higher bar. And this was in the case of an Ohio Ku Klux Klan organizer. And he was convicted under Ohio's syndicalism, radical syndicalism laws. And that he appealed and he won. And basically the standard then set by the Supreme Court in Brandenburg was your speech had to incite imminent lawless action. but if it didn't do that, everything else was permitted. So that's about as civil libertarian position that you'll find in just about any capitalist government. Most of them are much larger. There are other restrictions on speech, of course, which is laws of civic laws of defamation and the laws of libel, and those can restrict. But even there, they have a high bar of you have to prove malicious intent. And again, the United States sets a higher bar than that, and in a lot of other countries, you can be convicted for libel in England much easier than you can in the United States, for example. And in Germany, I remember when I was visiting over there, meeting some fellow leftists, and they said they were so amazed at our newspaper. They called it how lucky we were. You can print all this stuff, because they had in Germany what they called slander against the state, that your newspaper could be suppressed. I thought that was really weird. I said, well, we slander the state as much as we can all the time. So it varies from place to place. As far as the current thing, I don't think most of the left is against civil liberties. I think there's some sector of it, and I think it first began to emerge with Catherine McKinnon and one wing of the feminist movement a few decades back, where they began to try to find new critical legal theories that would enable them to shut down pornographic bookstores, because these were attacks on women. And so there was a lot of argument then from some feminists that those kind of free speech shouldn't apply to pornographers or whatever different porn parts of the porn industry. But even there, I don't think most people agreed with him. I think the recent thing of the January 6th is very interesting in terms of how it might apply, whether Trump's speech and Trump's organization for that rally fell under an advocacy of immediate lawless action. I think a case could be made that it can be. I think it may be. I don't know whether anybody's going to take them to court for it. But I think that in terms of some of the militia groups, they're going to be taken down, and I think the left should encourage them, and so should not defend them at all, because what they are being taken down for is not speech, but their actions. Their actions in terms of assaulting the people, everybody who was in the Capitol, the Capitol Police, Congress people, and so on, staff. They were engaged in an armed assault, and in some cases caused bodily harm and even death. So those are the kinds of things that I would defend, for instance, the Nazis' right to march through Cicero, but I would definitely not defend a KKK member's incitement at a lynch mob to carry out the lynching. That crosses the line. So in that sense, point I'm making is that nothing is really all that absolute. There are restrictions on everything. There's nothing in the universe that isn't limited in some way, including our democratic rights. But we just have to understand them in the most generous and beneficial way that will lead to our advance of our different struggles and our common humanity.
Thank you, Carl. Next, we have Ed Remus.
Thanks, Will. So I'm going to read an academic part of a paper I had prepared in an academic context, but essentially a selective review of the history of the left on this issue. So it'll come in at about 11 minutes, and I'll go ahead and start. In the days after the January 6th entry of pro-Trump protesters into the US Capitol building, as Glenn Greenwald appeared on Tucker Carlson to decry the Biden administration's plans to marshal big tech for a new war on terror, The American left's commitment to civil liberties could be described as wavering. Young leftists could be forgiven for believing that civil liberties and free speech are left-wing issues only insofar as they can be shown to advance the causes of economic redistribution and/or identitarian inclusion, for this is the lesson frequently taught by today's academic and activist left, if, that is, civil liberties and free speech are not dismissed outright as inherently right-wing issues. I aim to show how American Trotskyism preserved the political logic of Second International Marxism in its struggle for a liberal or civil libertarian socialism during an era when that struggle had been definitively eclipsed on the American and international left by the Bonapartist politics of progressive statism. The term liberal democracy, writes Helena Rosenblatt, would have seemed self-contradictory to most liberals in the 19th century, as the bourgeois revolution gave way to the industrial, as proletarian citizens without property turned to the state to address their inability to live by labor in society, and as an organized working class movement for socialism failed to achieve governing power, it was Napoleon III of France whose election and subsequent coup d'etat to save suffrage epitomized the politics of illiberal democracy under capitalism. Napoleon III's government seemed to constitute a new and hybrid type of rule, popular but authoritarian, both a police state and a welfare state. While the emperor used censorship and surveillance to stifle any opposition, he offered workers an unprecedented range of relief measures: soup kitchens, price controls on bread, insurance schemes, retirement plans, orphanages, nurseries, hospitals, tax relief, and grants to developers willing to build inexpensive housing. And all of it was widely reported in the state-controlled press. Caesarism, or Bonapartism, became the name for a modern form of democratic dictatorship. Some socialists, Rosenblatt notes, praised Napoleon III for his Caesarism. Some liberals thought that being liberal meant working with the emperor to introduce reforms like individual rights and a free press. For Marx, however, the working class itself had assumed the vanguard of the democratic revolution in 1848. Marx did not trust the state that laid the workers low with grapeshot to secure their bourgeois rights, whether in terms of employment or civil liberty. Bonapartism for Marx indicated that only a new proletarian state, which dictated social production, could address the mass bourgeois democratic discontents that drove Louis Napoleon's rise, while simultaneously securing the civil liberties his regime had trampled. Marx's critique of socialism's convergence with Bonapartism informed Second International Marxists, whose mass political parties championed civil liberties. Vernon Lidke writes that social democrats under Bismarck's Bonapartist regime assumed the responsibility of pushing forward the principles of liberalism, while the liberal parties themselves had weakened in this task. This spirit underwrote the planks of free press, association, assembly, and expression written into the Gotha and Erfurt programs. Likewise, Eugene Debs and Jean Jaurès have been accurately portrayed by one historian as citizen socialists committed to the bourgeois ideals of individual liberty, the republic, and the spirit of 1776 and 1789. Lenin called for all-sided political agitation to take up every liberal question of rights and liberties in a 1902 polemic against social democrats who took a quote-unquote class point of view, arguing that these social democrats' indifference to liberalism revealed their ignorance of Marxism. Lenin cited the Dreyfus affair as a case in point. When Jaurès threw himself into a multi-party campaign for Dreyfus's right to a fair trial, socialists such as Jules Guesda argued that this was a distraction from the class struggle, since Dreyfus was a bourgeois and a military officer. Lenin, Luxemburg, and Debs sided with Jaurès in taking up Dreyfus's civil liberties case, as did Karl Kautsky. They each viewed the class struggle not in sociological or economist terms, but ultimately in the political terms of the Socialist Party's struggle for proletarian governing power. With the failure of the World Revolution circa 1917 to 19, with the integration of the Second International Parties into capitalist state governance circa 1914 to 45, and with the Stalinization of the Third International beginning around 1927, Leon Trotsky's left opposition was among the few sections of the American and international left to remain ostensibly oppositional while retaining Second International Marxism's liberal approach to civil liberties and free speech. In 1938, citing the example of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, Trotsky argued that a victorious proletariat may find itself forced for a period of time to take special measures against the bourgeoisie, if the bourgeoisie adopts an attitude of open revolt against the worker state. Yet, Trotsky continued, if these exceptional measures are prolonged for long enough to create a permanent situation, then they carry the danger of giving a political monopoly to the workers' bureaucracy, becoming a source of its degeneration. Trotsky described the Soviet Union, with its hated suppression of the freedom of expression and of the press, as a living example of such a dynamic. There, he wrote, the highly Bonapartist Moscow bureaucracy formed a new caste which stifled workers' and peasants' opposition. Trotsky continued, the real tasks of the worker state do not consist in policing public opinion, but in freeing it from the yoke of capital. This can only be done by placing the means of production, which includes the production of information, in the hands of society in its entirety. Once this essential step towards socialism has been taken, all currents of opinion which have not taken arms against the dictatorship of the proletariat must be able to express themselves freely. It is the duty of the worker state to put in their hands, to all according to their numeric importance, the technical means necessary for this, printing presses, paper, means of transportation. One of the principal causes of the degeneration of the state machine is the monopolization of the press by the Stalinist bureaucracy, which risks to transform all the gains of the October Revolution into a pile of ruins. Trotsky applied the same logic to the United States. In a 1939 article justifying his agreement to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee, headed by Texas Democrat Martin Dies, Trotsky argued against state suppression of fascists and communists. As reactionaries, fascists could simply change color and adapt themselves to any kind of organizational form, and would gain ruling class and state sympathy during times of crisis no matter what. Suppressing communists would simply rehabilitate their crumbling reputations as persecuted fighters against the ruling classes. More importantly, state suppression, by which is meant here the violation of civil liberties, would inevitably bear down on the working class's most advanced elements. Therefore, Trotsky concluded, the working class must stand in defense of freedom for all political tendencies, including their own irreconcilable enemies. James P. Cannon criticized third period Stalinism for abandoning the fight for civil liberties. When Minneapolis prohibited and broke up radical meetings, the Stalinists accepted the situation as proof that the capitalists are against the workers and that the city officials are tools of the capitalists. Thus, they prove that there is no free speech, which they consider a point in their favor and a confirmation of their undergroundist political strategy. The Trotskyists, Cannon continued, have a different idea. They held that free speech and democratic rights in general should not be surrendered according to the logic that there is no justice under capitalism. They called for setting into motion a wide movement to draw in and support the rights of trade unions and other organizations. Like Lenin's Bolsheviks under Kerensky, Cannon concluded, American communists should insist upon free and open discussions of all questions and points of view in order that the workers may judge fairly for themselves. They should become the champions of free discussion. The Stalinist subsequent People's Front echoed liberal capitalist propaganda by conflating the defense of civil liberties with the defense of the bourgeois democratic state. James Burnham countered that civil liberties needed to be defended against the bourgeois democratic state, for which civil liberties had become a pleasant social luxury so long as capitalism as a whole is vigorous and expanding. It was precisely the democratic state administered by social democratic majorities, labor governments, or People's Front governments which, under anti-fascist pretenses, restricted civil liberties. Trotsky's United Front strategy called for joint action on specific issues between programmatically independent parties and organizations. The defense of civil liberties, Burnham argued, presented one of the most fruitful of all fields for the application of a genuine United Front tactic, offering a sought-after approach to the middle classes, which is in no sense capitulation. In his wartime writings, Cannon described the Trotskyist movement bearing the brunt of FDR's Bonapartism. Despite FDR's inclusion of freedom of speech among his 4 freedoms, the militant found its issues grounded or destroyed by the post office for criticizing the administration. It thereby gained, in Cannon's eyes, the honor of being the first workers' paper to suffer a reactionary attack on the freedom of the press, just as the Trotskyist movement was singled out for the first prosecution under the Anti-Labor Smith Act. Cannon himself was tried for sedition under the Smith Act, which criminalized ideas advocating forcible overthrow of the government. Cannon saw himself playing Eugene Debs to FDR's Woodrow Wilson. Like Debs, Cannon used his trial as an opportunity to champion the Bill of Rights and to articulate a vision of a peaceful transition to power on the analogy of the Republican Party before the Civil War. In a 1950 piece titled The Socialist View, Democracy as a Weapon, Hal Draper described a post-war culture of fear. McCarthyism for Draper was hardly the cause of this fear. Rather, the fear resulted directly from actions taken by the Truman administration's bureaucratic state with its charges based on guilt by association and punishment for dangerous thoughts. In the face of this Cold War against civil liberties, Americans for Democratic Action exemplified the full retreat beaten by the country's liberal spokesmen and labor leaders. They only opposed McCarthy's attacks because these attacks targeted Truman's Fair Deal administration itself, to which the liberal labor circles were bound by practical political considerations. This amounted to a liberal betrayal of liberalism. If there is one thing that has distinguished liberalism at its best, Draper held, it has been its firmness in taking a determined stand in defense of all forms of freedom for the expression of ideas. Draper took this liberalism to be essential to any truly socialist society. In the economic field, civil liberties would protect a factory manager's ability to take initiative from below without fearing charges of insubordination from state bureaucrats above. In the political realm, civil liberties would serve as a check against a new ruling class of state bureaucrats who own the means of production. And in cultural life, civil liberties would safeguard the remaking of man himself. Draper would later describe free speech as a test of politics. If Draper's Marxist defense of civil libertarianism is taken to have reinscribed the historic horizons of the political left, then the charge of illiberal leftism leveled by today's avowed right becomes a contradiction in terms. From a Marxist perspective, the contemporary left has not become illiberal. Rather, insofar as any ostensible left becomes illiberal, it is in that respect no longer leftist at all.
Thank you, Ed. All right, so thank you to all the panelists for your opening remarks. Now we'll have some time for you to give brief responses to each other's comments, and please try to keep these under 3 minutes. For our audience, you can start thinking about questions you'd like to pose to the panel. So starting now, you can begin raising your hand on in the Zoom. It always changes, but it should be under the participate, what is it? Sorry, the reactions button, reactions, raise your hand. Or you can alternatively write your question in the Q&A box and I will read it out loud. But first, to the panelists, I want to just flag a few things that you can choose to respond to or not in your responses. So, you know, it seems like everyone on the panel is holding up free speech. But one question is, what does it say about the left today that you have to make an argument for this rather than it being self-evident? And I think Ed was alluding to this at the end some, but there's a sense that, you know, it's almost something of an achievement, even if everyone agrees, like most of the left holds it up, that it's still somehow something of an achievement where in a long view, it can also just look like we're kind of back where we were 200 years ago, you know, before 1848, before Marx, just fighting for basic bourgeois liberties. So part of my question is about the historically specific task of socialism, as opposed to just the revolt of the third estate. You know, is there a socialist content to the left upholding free speech, or is it just an end in of itself? And so for Eric I was really struck by this notion that free speech is dangerous when the left is leading it in the way that it was in the Socialist Party of America, the era of the Second International, the early 20th century, that it actually was a threat to the capitalist state. And putting it that way, it partly just raises this question. It inflects the question of, you know, free speech, civil liberties as an end in of themselves versus as an actual threat to the capitalist order, as a kind of step toward achieving socialism, if you will. So in that partly brings up the question of the state, which, you know, Carl alluded to this in terms of violent state oppression. And Ed got at this explicitly, but the question of, as Marx put it, the Bonapartist capitalist state. And so it partly raises the issue of, you know, do we live in actualized liberal democracy, or more accurately, do we live in state capitalism, which is a kind of contradiction of liberal democracy? And I was actually recently looking at Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon recently, and he actually he brings up free speech explicitly, which I hadn't really realized before. And he's making an imminent critique of bourgeois society here after the failed revolutions of 1848. And he's talking about how bourgeois society is, in fact, it's contradicted by the political domination of the capitalist state. And so, you know, the way he puts it is in class terms. So he'll say, highlighting the bankruptcy of the bourgeoisie by saying, by heralding the Bonapartist capitalist state, the bourgeoisie have created a weapon over and above and also against itself. And that by propping up the state to suppress other classes, they've actually created a monster that suppresses bourgeois society itself. And similarly, that in silencing the freedom of the press, the freedom of the bourgeoisie's own press is silenced, et cetera. This type of rhetoric. But the question is, what would it mean for the left to lead the discourse around civil liberties and free speech in these terms? As in by showing how capitalism is imminently undermining basic bourgeois democratic demands through the capitalist state. And therefore simply demanding more democracy can seem to just reproduce the problem. With Ben, I think it explicitly, one of the things that your presentation brought up was the question of what is and what is not the left. And Ed provoked this at the end of his remarks, especially, in the context of not having a socialist party today. Who decides what the best of the left, as you put it, is or is not? Is it the New York Times? Is it, who decides that? And especially with much of what passes for the left today being anti-free speech when it, selectively, when it comes to perceived fascists or white supremacists or simply Trump voters, how does the working class distinguish between a kind of pro-free speech left and a kind of, New York Times liberal or even DSA leaders like AOC who selectively clamp down on it? And then, so I think that, I've addressed some things that relate to everyone. I guess, Carl, one point I just wanted to bring up was, the idea of natural law that you flagged at the beginning. It can seem like a kind of trans-historical point, as you, I think, alluded to, but how does this translate to what I raised about the kind of historically specific task of a socialist politics in particular? So you can address those or not, but think of those questions in mind and also responses to your panelists' opening remarks. So let's begin with Eric.
Okay. Yeah, I think the point you raised, Will, is a good one. That one factor that determines the level of repression is how successful the left is. And you have to expect that as the left becomes more successful, that more people will support a radical politics, you're likely to have more state repression of the left. And that was certainly the experience of World War I. I don't want to state it as a dogmatic law, but it seems to be a general tendency. And that's one thing that we need to expect. So it's, but of course, I mean, the point has been made by all the speakers that if you start allowing for repression of the right, you will find it will soon boomerang on you on the left. I wanted to respond to one thing Carl said. I am an absolutist when it comes to ideas. Be clear, that's a distinction between ideas and inciting people to take immediate action. There should be no idea that's ruled out of order. And Carl, you mentioned particularly the Nazis, that's about as abhorrent as you can get. They have the right to hold peaceful rallies, to distribute newspapers. That may seem obvious, but there are a lot of people who don't agree with it. It's clear they don't. That a substantial part of what calls itself the left does not believe in that fundamental principle. On the contrary, they believe that there are certain ideas that are so abhorrent, they need to be crushed. And if you make the point that it's a small little group, they say, well, it could be a large group. And if you allow them organized, they could become large in the future, which is exactly the argument that the Supreme Court made in cases where they suppressed the left. Just the fact that there's only a few people doesn't matter. They could become large in the future. Smash them now. So we should really avoid that kind of argument. And I think that is a real debate on the left. Now, I have to say this to Ed. We could have a whole panel and a plus on the Russian Revolution, but to have Trotsky sort of raised as a civil libertarian, really, his record was not good. And to take a case without getting into that huge topic, Lincoln is not a good example. Lincoln was not a democratic president. Sorry, he was not. He was suppressing people who had the perfect right to say, we don't agree with what you're doing. We think you should make peace with the South. Now, we don't agree with that, but that's not to the point. They had the right to do that. And when Lincoln suppressed them, he was setting very bad precedents that were then used during World War I to suppress the left. So that's not a good argument. You know, in fact, there's a case, Supreme Court case called the Milligan case that came out of the Civil War, in which the majority of the Supreme Court said, even in the midst of the Civil War, there are fundamental rights that Congress does not have the right to violate, or the president. That's an important point. Even during wartime, even during pandemics, these are fundamental rights, and we should be very reluctant to back off of that. And one final point, I don't think Trump violated the law. He's a schmuck. And, you know, I have nothing good to say about him, but you cannot say that, well, let's put it in terms of the left. We hold a rally and we denounce the state. And there's 100 people there and 25 of them go off and start smashing windows. Are we responsible? I don't think so. If Trump says, we want you to go to the Capitol and storm the Capitol and start bear spraying cops, yeah, that's an incitement to riot, but he didn't do that. He made vague statements about, you know, that election was stolen, et cetera. Very dangerous precedent. You're heading down that road and it will come back. It will come back. They'll start prosecuting people for holding speeches. And there were actually cases like this in the World War I period where the perfectly peaceful rally, some people went off and started breaking trams. It was a tram strike, and they prosecuted the speakers, even though they had not in any way urged that to happen. I don't think you want to go down that road. That's a dangerous road to go down. Much as we dislike Trump, he did not violate the law in that rally.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. So I sense there's a lot of responses people have. One thing I was just thinking is that the natural law, not to make too much of the point, Carl, that you made, but I would say natural law itself is also a kind of absolutism, right? So partly just
some versions of it are.
Sure. But anyway, let's go to Ben and then to you, Carl.
Yeah.
So Ben.
Well, first of all, even though it's not my preferred philosophical language, I would say that there's some basis for a natural law approach, even in Karl Marx and some of his thoughts about species being, or, you know, what Engels says in the Anti-During about how after with the end of class society, we can have a truly human morality. So I think that there are some threads there that you could that you could combine, you know, to get a Marxist defense of something like that. But yeah, it was actually really, you know, I mean, it's kind of funny. I think like there are lots of things that Eric and I could have a vigorous debate about that, you know, we probably do disagree about the party question and socialist strategy, but I think I agree with everything I just heard. And I wanted, there are a few things that have been raised in discussion, and I want to make sure I get to all of them, and I hope it's not too disconnected. So first of all, I would point out AOC is nothing like a DSA leader. She's somebody who is supported by the DSA, certainly, and you know, and had a membership at one point. I don't think she was ever an active member, and she's certainly not, you know,
She's still described as a DSA member, and like, you know, news reports that, like today that will come out will still describe her.
What are people criticizing her for?
So in this case, I think her views about speech, and I think that the fact that she's renewed her membership in the last couple of years, I would actually be pretty surprised if that were true. I think that's probably just journalists, you know, going out, you know, the 2018 thing. But whatever, maybe she has. She's certainly, even if she's.
Well, I'm not concerned about that. How did she go against free speech?
So and then I wanted to address that too. I think AOC has been a bit of a mixed bag on it. You know, I certainly don't think that she's, you know, that. Like, I don't like some of her statements about it, like, you know, like about, you know, regarding, you know, white supremacy as, you know, terrorism, which suggests, you know, support for applying the extremely draconian framework that's been built up in the war on terror to white supremacists. So I can certainly understand that sort of criticism, although she has also said that she doesn't support any new laws in the wake of January 6th. So I think she might not be as bad as all that. I think she's a politician who has sought out some sort of alliance with with DSA. I would make a distinction there. I think that I think on Trotsky, Trotsky and Lincoln are both people who I have generally positive evaluations of, but I think there's some like really some pretty sharp criticisms of both of them that would be correct, certainly about free speech. And this goes to one of Will's questions that he raised about what it says about the left that this is controversial. And I'd say whatever it says about the left that this is controversial now is something that it has said about the left throughout left history that it's been controversial. The existence of socialist parties, I'm sorry, is not enough to settle the question of what counts as the best of the left, because as anybody with a passing acquaintance with socialist history knows, the history of all hitherto existing socialist parties has been a history of vigorous and constant disagreement about everything, including very much questions about free speech. I quoted earlier a pamphlet by Rosa Luxemburg where she was arguing vigorously with Trotsky about free speech in 1918 when Trotsky was justifying extreme draconian crackdowns on free speech, and Luxemburg was making a Marxist argument that that was wrong and that he shouldn't do that. I would also point out that in that later Trotsky bit that Ed quoted, while I liked 99% of what Trotsky was saying in that quote, I will note that key phrase. Freedom of speech for all political currents that have not taken up arms against the state. And there is a really important, that is a loophole you could fly a spaceship through, because when you say political currents, notice not the individual people, but the political currents. So if somebody who belongs to your political current has taken up arms against the state, that even if you have not taken up arms against the state, even if you are not a member of any sort of armed organization, your political current as a whole can still be suppressed, which if you think about the history of free speech suppression in contexts like Northern Ireland, for example, that's a pretty significant distinction. So I think Trotsky was not great about this question. I think that the history of the socialist left includes lots of people who are very good about it and lots of people who are not very good about it, and that's still more or less the situation. These are fights that have to happen. What counts as the best of the left is a matter of evaluation, and that these are arguments and debates you have to have, whether they're it would be very nice to have a socialist party, but whether you had one or not, there are arguments and debates you have to have. One thing I wanted to make sure that I addressed, I know I've been talking for a little bit, but one thing I did want to at least briefly touch on is first, I do strongly agree with Eric's point about about January 6th. I think that making claims about stolen elections and then sort of using militant rhetoric is not the same. It's not as incitement to engage in specific illegal activities, and that it's extremely easy to imagine a scenario where the shoe is on the other foot, and we would want to make that distinction. And I also think that there has been quite a bit of extreme prosecution of rioters on January 6th, for not much in many cases, for just illegal entry, which is not something I'm crazy about the precedent. I think that January 6th was you can certainly call it a riot. I think there's been a lot of extremely overheated and really indefensible claims about how it was an insurrection, it was an attempted coup. It wasn't really any of those things. In fact, Carl mentioned people being armed. Well, earlier reports made it sound like pretty much everybody was armed. Subsequent corrections have shown that almost nobody was armed. I think there was like one person who, in their court case so far, they've actually said they had a gun on them. And crucially, very unusually for insurrections, none of the, anybody there who did have a gun, which seems to have actually been an unusually low number for a right-wing protest, anybody there who did have a gun didn't fire it. The only gun that was fired was by a cop shooting a unarmed protester. And I also heard a claim from Carl that an assault led to someone's death. That's not true. That was reported at the time. Brian Sicknick, the Capitol police officer, they initially said that he'd been clubbed with a fire hydrant and then he died of his injuries.
Right. This is in the Glenn Greenwald piece, clears a lot of this up. Sorry to interrupt, but it's I want to make sure to get to others. And
yeah,
I think,
So very briefly, I think a lot of the factual claims are wrong. We could go through that, but I'll skip over all that. I also think there's an important point of principle here, which is that it sets a really bad precedent. And I'm particularly worried in how much of this is on the left and how much of this is liberals and how much of this is people indeterminate between the two. We can argue about, but there have been, like, if you read some of what's been published at places like The Nation, not so much, Jacobin, I'm proud to say, but places like The Nation magazine about January 6th, there's a lot of calling for like really draconian stuff that would apply just as much to lots of left-wing protests like Chaz. The thing that, and in fact, a lot of the legal theories that have been trotted out seem to be used right now by state legislatures that want to pass, conservative state legislatures that want to pass draconian laws to crack down on any protest where anybody does anything illegal, even if you didn't participate in the illegal thing. I think that, I would have been very upset if everybody who'd occupied the Wisconsin state capitol in 2011, was prosecuted for illegal entry. And I think we need to be careful about this. I think the thing that was bad about January 6th primarily is that they had bad politics and a bad cause. It was all based on lies about the election being stolen. But I think that beyond that, it was a rowdy protest that turned into a very minor riot, and I think it's a big mistake, especially from a civil liberties perspective, to make too much of that.
thanks. I mean, fortunately, it doesn't seem like that is a sticking point, or really we don't want that to become, what the panel is about in terms of making sense of the language of how to describe January 6th. But I mean, fortunately, it seems to be an actual consistent general point among the panel. One thing I just wanted to say, Ben, you brought up the party and kind of maybe even upholding the party as some kind of lipness for the left in terms of, oh, well, look, they were always disagreeing. Well, I would just say, like, of course they were. That was the point of the party, as in, the party is not for everyone to agree, but rather it seems to be the highest form of debate at its best. Like the kind of classical notion of what a party is a site of, there's a common cause, a common social class, often a class cause in the case of socialist parties, that of course people aren't going to agree about everything. And occasionally Trotsky and Luxemburg and Lenin will have very occasional disagreements, but the understanding is they're part of a party, or in the Second International, a collection of socialist parties that is going to act, despite disagreeing on certain things, they're going to act in tandem and use the actual debates and controversies to push the movement forward, rather than the kind of neoliberal context we live in, where there is no clear mediation. There's no party or organizational mediation of the dialogue itself to make it a productive disagreement. But let's transition to Carl.
Yeah. There was an interesting article in the New York Times this morning. I was on a group called The Order. And it went into the history of it and talked about it as the precursor to some of the things that are going on today on the far right. For those of you who don't know, the Order was formed back in the 1980s. And I first came across it when I was in an anti-Klan project of the October League. We ran into these guys because we surreptitiously would send people to Klan rallies to figure out so we had some intelligence about what was going on. But the Order struck our attention because we understood it correctly so as a revolutionary fascist organization. And we got a hold of its manual, recruiting manual, which was a novel called The Turner Diaries, put out by William Pierce. And I don't know if any of you have ever read it. It might be worth your while. It's kind of hair-raising, blood-curdling anti-Semitism and anti-racism on a scale you've probably never read before. But in any case, the Order was they use what they called their understanding of Lenin to organize themselves. They organized themselves conspiratorially and secretly. And then they made it their business to rob Brinks Brothers trucks mainly and a few banks. And then they assassinated a Jewish radio talk show host in Colorado. And then they did, other sorts of nefarious illegal activities until finally the FBI cracked down on them and busted them all. And finally the last of them died in prison. Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, was a follower of the order, and he kept a copy of the Turner Diaries with him at all times. So I think this is interesting in terms of ability to make a distinction. I think that William Pierce had a perfect right to write and publish the Turner Diaries and to circulate it for people to read, or even to organize study groups around it. But once it became what the order became, which was a counter-revolutionary illegal criminal organization that was robbing banks and Brinks Brothers trucks and assassinating Jewish radio announcers, it needed to be broken up and busted. And the left should have called for, most people on the left didn't know that much about it, but we certainly called for the arrests and breaking up of the order. Not because that they published the Turner Diaries, but because of their counter-revolutionary criminal activities that they were carrying on. So the New York Times this morning, brings all this up because it wants us to look at it in terms of some of the right-wing militia groups that we have, the Oath Keepers and Boogaloo Boys, and it's a whole cluster of them. They were particularly concerned about the ones who tried to kidnap the governor of Michigan, and they laid all sorts of plans to blow up things around her living quarters and so on, to take over, bring in their arms and take over the Michigan legislature. So you could make a certain case that some of their activities were just spectacle and therefore would be protected under the First Amendment. But some of the others were actually a criminal conspiracy to kidnap and harm the governor of Michigan. So for those reasons, I think that it's correct for the left to call and defend the prosecution of these people for what they do, and not so much for what they're trying to say, but what they're doing. What they're doing is counter-revolutionary and criminal, and they need to be busted up. And we need to be an advocate for breaking up these kinds of criminal gangs.
Thank you, Carl. Just for the sake of time, so we can get to the Q&A, I'm going to have to cut you off and ask Ed for his quick responses.
Yeah, so a few issues. I guess just one on that last point that was raised. There is an essay that I did not refer to much by Hal Draper. It's a great piece called Free Speech and Political Struggle. And there Draper talks about how in the context of Weimar Germany, the government actually had plenty of grounds on which to suppress the Nazi Party, not based on speech, but based on action. So I think that's an important distinction, right? He really underlines that distinction. If we're talking about actions, then yes, absolutely. If we're talking about speech or the exchange of ideas and views, then no, there's not grounds for suppression. So I think that's an important point. And whatever is happening today, I think that's the grounds that we would want to bring to the evaluation of those situations. So a few other points that came up. I guess I should say with respect to Trotsky, I was intentionally not upholding him as a historical actor, not necessarily because I have an opinion on one side or the other, but I was sort of sidestepping those issues. I am thinking, for example, in response to your comments, Eric, about the fact that, for example, Lenin criticized Trotsky's attempt to collapse the party in the unions. Lenin had a more a vision of multi-parties and a distinction between party and state and union. And he did criticize Trotsky for a kind of illiberalism on trying to collapse the party and the union. So I do think there are grounds, certainly, if one is looking at Trotsky as a historical actor, there are certainly grounds for a critique from a civil libertarian perspective. And Ben, to your comment, I didn't take him to be advocating the suppression of individuals based on their membership in a political current. But I do agree with you, that's an important distinction, right? To distinguish between individual actions and individual membership in a political current that takes up arms against the government. Yeah, I agree that that would be important. And also I agree that it would be important to uphold civil liberties during wartime, as the Lincoln example was raised. With respect to parties, it's interesting that if you look at the tendency that came out of Max Shachtman, of which Hal Draper was a member, that came out of Fourth International Trotskyism, there's a piece in which Draper or Shachtman, I'm forgetting exactly who, basically describes how ridiculous it would have been for someone like Lenin to go to Germany to get sort of direct marching orders from Karl Kautsky, right, when deciding on what to do under Russian conditions, or for Debs to go to the Pope of Marxism in Germany, right, to get his marching orders. Debs famously refused to take orders from Zinoviev, right? But this became the model for the Third International, and so I think that's an important limitation. With respect to your book, Eric, and your arguments, I think they're very significant. I have in mind, for example, that Jacobin Magazine has published some pieces citing Laura Weinrib's work on civil liberties, and she essentially argues that civil liberties are only radical when they support a collective vision for redistribution based on labor unions, and that they're otherwise conservative if they advocate what she essentially sees as kind of ranting about revolution, right, or expressing individual opinions. That's sort of a more conservative version for civil liberties in her view. And I think your book and your argument, you correctly emphasize that what was incipiently radical about Debsian socialism was that a mass political party was taking a specifically political stance, right? If war, if the state at its essence is armed bodies of men, the most political stance you could take for an oppositional political party would be sort of against militarism and war. This is sort of echoing Lenin's vision of the Second International Party serving as tribunes of the people, right? And so I think, in short, if you operate in a context, in a party or in a movement that is the state, right, then you're not able to really take an oppositional perspective. You're not able to serve as the tribune of the people. You become an adjunct of the state. And that's just a very basic political point that I think runs through the history of Marxism and socialism. And so I think Ben and I are coming from different perspectives there. I would say that
sorry, can you say how? I don't, because you, I thought I was following along with everything. Then you said it was you were disagreeing with me somehow, and I think I missed the disagreement.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that Eric's work emphasizes, I think correctly, that what was actually sort of radical and recognized by the Wilson administration as such was the fact that, Debs wasn't a Democrat, right? Mm-hmm. Debs was a socialist. He was running as an oppositional political party, and he gained mass adherents on the basis, yes, also the party lost some, right? Actually, the American party was kind of, fortunate in that respect, you could say, compared to the German. In the German case, the party became pro-war. In the American case, the pro-war progressives left the party. So the party actually had an oppositional anti-war stance that it maintained. And it lost members, but it also gained many members who maybe were not dyed-in-the-wool Marxists, right? But on liberal grounds, they agreed that the party was serving as the tribune of the people. They were against militarism and war. And so they joined the Socialist Party, or they became involved in its activities. And that's very important. That's the sort of liberal civil libertarian political grounds on which socialist parties historically were able to expand beyond the labor movement, right? Beyond becoming just trade union bureaucrats to actually contending for governing power in countries across the world. So that was the vision of what the historical Socialist Party could do. Right. And, obviously people disagree with that today. But I guess what I'm saying is that if you're an adjunct of the state, if you're in civil social movements or parties that are basically state adjuncts, as the left is today, then that entire horizon of political activity is basically unavailable. And so I think that's an important distinction.
Oh, okay. I get it now. Yeah. Well, up until that last couple sentences, I agreed with every word you said. I think that I think that I make a distinction between electoral tactics and state and party apparatus, which strikes me as a extremely different topic than the one that I thought we were talking about. But I think if you I think that if you look at like what Seth Ackerman has written about this party of a new type, stuff like that, he makes exactly the right distinction. Of course, we need a socialist party. The question of what the electoral tactics of that party should be is very different. And I think you also need in the American context to separate out, the sort of ballot lines that exist in the United States from what party means, certainly in Europe, in Europe or Latin America or other places.
Yeah, so just briefly on that, and then just one more brief point. I would say that in general, the sort of Jacobin affiliated left today imagines a socialist party or a labor party as an electoralist party with a civil social base. And I would say, in short, at the risk of kind of condensing these issues, the Debsian Socialist Party rather imagined itself, or at least its left wing did, as more of a civil social party with an electoral arm. And so I think there are sort of, and maybe Eric could get to this, but there are sort of different imaginations of what the party would mean.
Yeah, I think
I want to make sure to get to, we're about at 2:30, so I do want to make sure to get questions and answers. So whatever responses you have right now, try to fill them into your responses to the questions or your closing remarks. Okay. So let's first, I want to get to some people with their hands raised. So the first one I see is Brock Lewis. So can we unmute Brock?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. All right, so my question is, this panel title is the free speech and the left. And with that in mind, my first question is, who or what is the left today? And in order to hopefully spark some lively conversation, can each of the panelists please discuss how they classify the American Republican and Democratic parties as left or right? And what do each of you think is the perspective of these parties, the American parties, to free speech today? So who's the left? Yeah.
I'll bite.
I was just going to say before, I meant to say this is to the panelists, please don't respond to the Q&A box until I address the questions, just to help the audience get a kind of coherent flow. So the questions that are addressed, respond to. So this one, it sounds like anyone can respond to. So Carl, if you want to go ahead.
Well, I've written a piece. It's got some sort of, it's actually several versions of it, called the U.S. Six-Party System, that tries to waken people up to what really the political terrain is. I think the Democratic Party is a mixed bag. There's a left in it. It's the people, I call it, for want of a better term, the rainbow populists around AOC and Bernie. So to me, that's today's left. Biden and other folks are more of the center. And then the Republican Party is now a fascist party, or at best a party that is contained with has a fascist core and expresses a kind of nationalist right-wing populism, white supremacism, so on. So that's how I'd characterize. So it's clearly the party of the right. I think it's the target of our main danger and the target of our main blow at the moment. Not that we don't need to maintain some independence and initiative in our expressing our disagreements and agreements with Biden and his group.
There is some tension there because what came up about AOC earlier, just to clarify, I
love AOC. She's my leader, so.
That's what I hear. But I guess to clarify, you were asking like, how is she being framed as anti-free speech? Well, she basically was coming down on Facebook and others for not silencing, supposed hate speech, right? And so this was, this is the grounds on which she's been described.
I don't disagree with her on that. I think Facebook could do better job of cleaning out some of the garbage that makes use of its platform.
Although this does bring back the distinction you made between speech and action, right? To what
Well, first
extent
of all,
is
Facebook is a private business. It's not the government. So that
right? Well, that would be so
I run websites, a number of them, and I edit out all kinds of shit, and Facebook should too.
well, that I guess the point is that AOC is calling on this state to actually to clamp down on what you're rightly describing as civil social, albeit supported by corporate, social media platform speech.
Mhm.
So that just to say, like there is a tension there. But does anyone else want to address this question?
Can I go more general?
Sorry, Eric, you go.
point? Can I address the more general point? I mean, trying to figure out what the left is doesn't get you anywhere. Obviously, that just gets back to your initial point of view. My position on Democratic and Republican Party is the position that Debs had. Both of the parties are corporate parties. And an essential step for a genuine working class movement in the United States is breaking from the Democratic Party. That's always been the historic position of socialists. And very much was Debs's position. I think it's still correct. Well, one of the things that's changed is the Republican Party used to be the primary party of the capitalist class in a sense, but they were both capitalist parties. But the majority of the real powers that be supported the Republican Party during the Woodrow Wilson era, for instance. That was J.P. Morgan and Wilson didn't get along very well. That's now changed. Biden is now the candidate of the capitalist class. I mean that very literally. The capitalists support Biden. You can see that in the mass media. You can see that in the funding the Democratic Party gets. The Democratic Party is now the favored party of the capitalist class. How you as a socialist can be in such a party is beyond me.
Well, I can explain it to you if you want, but that would be a whole
Well, you did,
other
actually,
forum.
you did. You did explain it to me. I don't buy it. I mean, that's the thing. And it's not a new argument, of course. At the time Debs was around, the progressives were in the Republican and the Democratic Party. They were quite strong, actually. And Debs was absolutely opposed to that position. He said, you're not going to change the Democratic and Republican parties. The way to do forward is to have an explicitly socialist party. Now, I live in Scotland, but I know enough about US politics to know that the number of people who agree with me is pretty small.
Right.
So I'm not claiming to represent the left, whatever the hell that might mean, but I still think Debs was right. Debs was right. What we need is an explicitly socialist party with a mass base in the working class.
So I guess just real quickly, because there are like 20 issues in play, and most of them are at best tenuously related to free speech. But I do want to just hit a few points. I think that one thing you have to say about the Democratic and Republican parties is they're absolutely not parties in the sense that we mean in a European context or other parts of the world, and in the sense that I think is most relevant to the role that's historically played by socialist parties. They're ballot lines. And that they have so in that sense, I guess I am closer to Carl's position on that part. I don't think the Republicans are fascists. Daniel Bessner and I wrote an article about that in January. You can read in Jacobin. It's called "Trump is a Threat to Democracy," but that doesn't mean he's winning, which is not a great headline for what the article says. But in any case, we give our extensive argument that the fascism analogy is misguided. You can read it there. Similarly, I would point out that the overwhelming majority, Jacobin, like Platypus, hosts a wide variety of points of view, but the overwhelming majority of stuff that's published at Jacobin is extraordinarily pro free speech. I know that's certainly the position of people like Bhaskar Sunkara, the main editor, who's pretty absolutist about free speech. I also think that if again, various people with various points of view write for Jacobin, and DSA is an extremely broad and loose organization. In fact, probably too broad and loose to play the role that it should play, in my view. But if you want to talk about the Jacobin DSA sort of view, certainly the parts of those things that I identify with, I think they do think of a socialist party as a civil social organization, primarily with an electoral component, which is actually the point I thought I was making by pointing out that distinction between party machines, where you do need a separate organization, and party ballot lines, which I view as a distantly secondary tactical question. That's, you know, that strikes me as a very that strikes me as its own panel that we could spend 2 hours arguing about. But you know, for the record, if you want to do that, I'm happy to come back and do it. But I did just want to really briefly address, I think, my most important point of disagreement with you know, with Carl and yeah, with you know, with AOC, who I think on this question is way too much of a normie Democrat, who which is about Facebook and all of that, because I think that it's a real mistake for leftists to adopt that market libertarian view about free speech, according to which only government can be a problem, and as long as something's a private business, nothing it's doing can be a threat to free speech. I think that given that we live in a capitalist society, and a few corporations have a massive amount of control over the flow of information in practice. You know, you can post videos on other places than YouTube, but you know, good luck having anybody ever encounter them. I think that that capitalist firms can absolutely you know, threaten free speech. I think that we should talk more about free speech in the workplace. And I think absolutely the corporate deplatforming should be part of our concern about free speech. I mean, the Hollywood blacklist in the 1950s was encouraged by the government, although of course, granted, Facebook crackdowns are being now too, but that was implemented by private organizations, the Hollywood studios. I don't think that means there's nothing to see there as far as free speech goes.
Thanks. Ed, do you want to speak to this issue of like the connection between free speech and the party, or before we move on?
Yeah, I could try to do that. I guess just to register a few points, I agree with Ben, Trump is not a fascist. I agree with Eric that historically the left-wing position was the need for an independent socialist party. I think that the electoral vision of that party was to use its electoral success to gauge the extent to which it had organized civil society, right? And then also to use as a platform for sort of advocating the socialist perspective. So I'm not sure if it's that gets to the issue of party machines versus ballot lines. But yeah, I mean, and Ben, we might take up on that. That sounds great. I think that's an issue, you know, worth discussing sort of on a separate panel. With respect to the relationship of free speech to the party, you know, I think that so one reason why I returned, going back to the Trotsky quote, right? Our exchanges over Trotsky can seem to be a little bit of a, you know, a dead end and non sequitur. But what I really wanted to emphasize in that Trotsky quote is that Trotsky is recovering Marx's concept of Bonapartism, right? And he's seeing it. He is analyzing the Stalinization of the USSR and of the Bolshevik Party through the lens of Bonapartism. And James Burnham, for example, will also then look at FDR and Henry Wallace and the actions of the Communist Party in the United States and view them through the lens of Bonapartism. And I think, in short, what that implies is that they're like the democracy, the democratic tendency in society is going to have also an illiberal tendency, right? There will always be this risk of democracy trampling liberalism, trampling civil rights, trampling free speech, right? And certainly for Draper, the only way that you can get around that is in and through an independent socialist movement and eventually party that undertakes conscious organization and conscious education in a widespread manner, as the Second International parties historically did, to teach people about the importance of civil liberties and including free speech, while also undertaking actions, right, including broad coalition actions in support of those rights and liberties. I think, in short, for Draper, the only way that you could actually get to socialism was in and through that kind of civil libertarian mass movement that was constantly sort of vigilant and on guard against the capitalist state. And, you know, I suppose we could talk endlessly about whether or not the existing parties in this country, you know, perform such a function or could. But I think certainly, you know, as Eric sort of implied, from the perspective of Debsian socialism, at least, that would not be That would not be a kind of movement like that, and the tasks of educating and organizing in that spirit should not be expected to come in or through the existing parties today. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Thanks. That also addresses the question of, free speech as an ends in of itself versus what sounds like this earlier conception of how it is a means, and how, as it's come into conflict in capitalism, it's still a requisite kind of instrument for the socialist movement, by putting it in terms of educational, that there's an educational purpose it can serve for in the context of a party or an organization for socialism, that is not simply about like, here's our position, like we want our position to be represented, but rather how can we use civil liberties and free speech to actually show and educate the working class about its historical consciousness task. So let's call on Grace Hart next, if you can unmute her.
Hi, thank you everyone for your thoughts. I briefly have a question about social media. So many younger leftists who have grown up with technology like social media and particularly YouTube have raised concerns that the algorithm, especially for young people, turns into a kind of alt-right pipeline, and like suggesting videos such as like red-haired feminist gets wrecked or social libtard destroyed. And they think this radicalizes young people in a particularly negative way. And I was wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that.
Does anyone want to address that first?
Well, I agree that, a lot of the content of YouTube is problematic, and that some of it needs to be called out by well, I think Google owns YouTube. It needs to be called out. But on the other hand, I think that the left needs to make more use of YouTube. I know I tried to do, try to put things up there and get them circulated around. But we need to do a lot of revolutionary education using these platforms ourselves. In fact, in some ways, we're too weak at it. I try to do some of it myself through various means, the online university left and other things. But I agree that it's problematic.
I mean, I guess I just briefly say that I agree with Carl about the left needing to do more on YouTube, but I think that Eric's point at the very beginning of the panel about having confidence in our own ideas is the key here. That it's that instead of worrying that if people are exposed to the ideas of our enemies, including our really like most vile enemies, like fascists, I think that we should want to preserve these places as fairly open spaces for discussion and be confident that we'll win in that discussion.
I personally do think this is a complicated issue. I have to admit, I was influenced by the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix in this particular regard of, we talk about the algorithm kind of casually, but there is maybe something, this doesn't undercut Ben's point at all, but I do think there is a sort of particular dilemma about the fact that they're on a massive scale with who knows, like the googolplex of gigabytes that this stuff is working in terms of processing speed. There is an actual incentivizing of provocative, fiery, I should say demagogic rhetoric per se. Like literally it gets more likes, right? It gets more views, more money. That is like a motive. There is a kind of objective, mechanical, algorithmic factor to that it doesn't undercut, but I just want to flag. I think this is like, I don't know if we've come to grips with this question as a specific, technologically, historically specific issue. Anyway.
I just want to sort of mention 2 points, I guess, informed by the deeper history of socialism. One is that I think we can only expect today that the capitalist parties and sort of institutions will happily exacerbate culture war divides. And that points, I think, also to the historic task of the socialist movement, which was to organize across and against the dividing lines that the capitalist parties and institutions were only too happy to create or perpetuate in society. And so I think that, you know, what you're citing is almost sounds like an example of that, and would need to be in some sense addressed through organizing and education from a historically socialist point of view. I think the other point I would make is that, you know, we live in this kind of very unusual ideological environment where a young person coming up online might think that because they support free speech and gun rights and they're a bit distrustful of the state and the HR department, they are therefore a hard right-winger or a fascist, right? They might provocatively call themselves a fascist on the basis of those commitments, which is sort of absurd, right? But given in many ways in which I think the ostensible left has abandoned some of its historic commitments, there's a lot of confusion out there. And I think what we need to recognize is that at least many people who do not, arguably most people who do not identify as leftists today, basically have a kind of civil libertarian or liberal bourgeois set of aspirations and discontents that socialist parties historically organized and appealed to. And I think that has to be recovered, that sensibility, if there is to be a left in the future.
Thank you. Eric, did you have something?
No, I agree entirely with what Ed was saying. I was a little bit puzzled about the gun control one. This seems to be a hot topic in the US left. You know, I live in Scotland, there are no guns. They're not allowed. And that's not a panacea. No, there's still, you know, there's violence, gangs, but at least they don't go around gunning several people down when they're feeling unhappy. So I guess I don't quite get that. I don't see what is so, yeah. To me, it just seems that's just the way things are. There are no guns, and that's good, isn't it? Isn't it good to live in a society where everybody isn't armed to the teeth? I mean, what's the point of that? I don't get. Is someone seriously think when we have a revolution, our little pop guns are going to go against the Pentagon? I mean, come on, guys, that makes no sense whatsoever. So. It seems to me that the vast distribution of guns in the United States, which is unique to the United States among developed capitalist countries, it just means a lot of dead people. That's all.
I'd also point out that without necessarily taking any position one way or the other about gun rights, which is a huge and complicated topic, that it does, as far as I can tell, this is an interesting difference even on the revolutionary left, Trotskyists, people like that, between Americans and everybody else. That there don't seem to be, even in like Trotskyite sects and, you know, places like the UK or France, you know, there doesn't seem to be a lot of support for gun rights. You know, I only really see people making sort of the socialist case for gun rights in the US, you know, so that might be an artifact. That doesn't necessarily mean that one side or the other is right, but that might be an artifact of the different larger political cultures in those countries.
I'm not sure. I mean, this isn't a Second Amendment in the left panel, so I'm not sure if we want to prosecute this issue too much, but I feel like it is related, isn't it? Maybe Ed, do you have something to say?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, certainly, Eric, I agree with you that that a putschist logic is entirely wrongheaded. I agree with you completely there. You know, I would say that historically the American left, including, I believe, the Debsian tradition, was animated by the spirit of '76, even with respect to the Second Amendment. I think that, Eric, you made a good point that that insofar as an actually oppositional socialist movement and party gains in strength and power, then one could expect the suppression of civil liberties, right? The exercise of those civil liberties will become more threatening to the state, right? And I would say that a kind of parallel logic could be seen to apply to Second Amendment rights. Certainly and I guess this is more vis-a-vis corporations than the state, but certainly the labor movement thought that if the Pinkertons were going to be armed, then the unions should defensively arm themselves, that striking workers should defensively arm themselves with the expectation that they may be fired upon and may need to exchange fire. There's also a great book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, about sort of defensive Second Amendment rights and the importance of defensive armament in the civil rights movement. So I think there are a few historical touch points, but I agree this is sort of another issue.
Before we run out of time, I'd like to make one, I think you can take it as my concluding remark.
Well, we do have some time for more questions, just to sorry to interrupt, but I have 2:50. I thought we were going to 3 o'clock. Sure. So yeah, go ahead and make your point, but we'll come back to you for concluding remarks as well.
Okay. Well, context matters when discussing these things. Take the example of the Reconstruction era, which I think we can make a good case to see the Reconstruction governments in that period as our Paris Commune, except they were larger and they lasted longer. They were able to survive because of armed suppression of the neo-Confederates, or the old Confederates, they organized themselves in a trend called the Redeemers, and as the federal troops were drawn out, they organized armed assaults and murder, and basically overthrew what was an interracial governments of the poor with African American leadership. I think that the case should be made that we could criticize the radical Republicans at the time of not suppressing that and making an armed suppression of it, and stripping. They gave the political rights back to the leaders of the Confederacy way too quickly and way too generously. And I think they should have disarmed them too. And if that had happened, I think we would have had a much better political history. And there would have been much more freedom of expression within the Reconstruction governments than anything that ever happened since then in the South. The Reconstruction governments were able to pass public schools, women's rights, all kinds of radical democratic gains that benefited both the Black and white poor at the time. And with their overthrow, that was suppressed. And that kind of future for the American working class was set back, to this day.
Thank you, Carl. So let's have one more question from the audience. And Ben, I understand you have a quick 3 o'clock deadline to start your interview with Zizek. So let's have a question from Sam Johnson, and we'll have Ben respond first. And Ben, you can use your response as your concluding remark.
Sounds good.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to ask, a lot of the larger discussion has been around the socialist position as it relates to organizations and entities which the left, at least at this current moment, doesn't really have any influence in. So I'm thinking of the comments around the New York Times, or really governmental policy is not something that the left has power within. And I wanted the panelists to comment on free speech as sort of a cultural norm, and how they feel the left practices free speech within its own organizations in the present, and how that might contrast with something of like the Second International. I'm thinking of Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, her polemic against Bernstein, and how Bernstein and Rosa existed in the same party and vehemently disagreed. And in my experience with the left, the disagreements are often aired on hot button topics like Israel, Palestine, or gun rights, and tend to lead towards one group achieving ascendancy and the other group either leaving the organization or forming an alternate organization. So I was just wondering what the panelists thought about free speech as a cultural practice amongst the left.
Yeah, that's a great question. And since this is also going to be my concluding remark, because I have to run, I just want to say, thank you so much, guys, for having me. This is a really interesting discussion, and yeah, this is I'm glad we could make this work. I think about free speech on the left. I'm trying not to be, not to be too much of an pedantic analytic philosophy nerd, and because I have that little voice back in my head. Well, is this really a free speech issue exactly? Like, you're talking about like the sort of value of open discussion, which is certainly part of why we care about free speech. But I'll try to suppress that part of myself and just answer what I think is the core of the question, which is that I do agree that there is a tendency on much of the left to respond to sort of trivial disagreements with mutual bulls of excommunication and even forming different organizations sometimes. And I guess this is a sense in which I despite what I said earlier, then the party question does become relevant again, because I think that when we're just sort of talking about about people commenting on politics and not meaningfully participating on it, I think it's very easy to get those endless, those endless splits that give rise to 3,000 different Trotskyist organizations or whatever, because very little is at stake. Whereas in context where there's much more at stake, because you've actually managed to build up something that you care about vying for ascendancy in, there's less of a tendency to do that. I mean, obviously, there are cases, even in the Debs period, the Socialist Party versus Daniel Delan's, Socialist Labor Party, and certainly, after World War I and the Russian Revolution, the split off of the Third International from the Second, which, by the way, it's this will be my spiciest take today, I think was a mistake. That the Bolsheviks, I think, should have stayed in the Second International, but and then certainly, and then more and more so later. And then I think by the time you get to the Fourth International, you've got like so little at stake that it's very easy to start getting those profusions of constant splitting. I actually think that it's a healthy sign. I mean, we can disagree about the usefulness of saying the left is dead, but it's certainly seen better days. And I think that I think it is a healthy sign that in the last basically since DSA as it now existed came into existence, which was approximately 2015 when it changed from being a glorified mailing list of a few hundred people to having tens of thousands of active members. As many things as I'd be critical of DSA about, I think it is a good sign that it hasn't had those sorts of splits, that there haven't been any splinter organizations, formed in the last few years, because at least relatively speaking to how dismal our starting point was, we're starting to get to the point where there might be something a little bit at stake, or at least I really, really hope so. But I also I think take the larger point behind the question that we need a culture of democratic debate, which doesn't just mean don't take your ball and go home to a splinter organization, but it also means it also means don't sort of rush to denounce people as secret reactionaries every time you have a disagreement, because if you do it that way, you're not going to internally within your subculture get the kind of benefits that we hope for free speech, within the larger society. So so I agree. I think a bunch of really interesting disagreements came up here that that all deserve their own own little panels, but I think that I do like the broad consensus on the importance of free speech. And with that, I got to run. Thank you again, comrades.
All right, thank you, Ben. Take care. All right, so for the other let's go in order of the opening remarks. So next, Eric, if you want to respond to Sam's question about free speech not just getting lumped into the culture wars, but its relation to socialist politics instead, and to use this as your concluding remarks as well.
I think it's been a good discussion. Sure, it's important to encourage debate within a socialist organization. I agree with everything with Ben said. I just take it a step further. I think we need to institutionalize it in terms of term limits in office. It's just not good to have the same people in leadership year after year. Term limits, affirmative action, to make sure that there are women in the leadership, people of color in the leadership, all those kinds of things. That's making a democratic an organization genuinely democratic. Having said that, of course, there are limits to what the debate can be within an organization. To take the Socialist Party case, it was a mass party, and it encouraged debate. But as the United States entered World War I, there was a minority, but it was a significant number who supported the war. And even though the great majority opposed the war, and furthermore, the people who supported the war tended to, they supported an administration that was crushing the Socialist Party, and some of them got expelled. Correctly, I think. There are limits. That was one of them. And then, the party had a democratic decision-making process. It overwhelmingly decided to oppose the war. And if you continue to publicly support the war and support an administration that was cracking down on the Socialist Party, then you were in the wrong party. Sorry. Most of them left, but some got expelled. So there are limits. And exactly what those limits are, it's a tricky question to get back to historical context, depends on the exact circumstances. But it's not like you can say anything you want and everybody will say, well, that's an interesting point. No, it's a socialist organization, has certain principles. And those principles, you move beyond those, you're likely to find yourself outside of the organization. Just one final point, it's a different question, but Carl raised a point of clear and present danger argument. If you're interested in learning more about the historical context in which that arose, and it came from people who supported the war, I deal with it in detail in my book, so I'll stop there.
Good. I'll just make a brief point. My biggest problem around speech is to get people outside their comfort zones. We don't need a left that talks to itself. I live in a very proletarian, blue-collar, white county that went 60-40 for Trump. So my thing that I do is just, we have to engage people who disagree with us. We have to get out, we have to talk to pro-Trump workers. And so we need more and more of that kind of speech. And if you write that kind of speech out of your practice, you're not doing the right thing.
Thanks. Thank you, Carl. That just before I go to Ed, this language of, getting people out of their comfort zones, and also what Eric said about, there needs to be more consequences to disagreements than simply, I have a better position, or I'm, it gets back to this point about that you raised about the Debsian party actually being a threat, a political threat. And so there's maybe somewhat counterintuitively, there's the idea that part of the goal would be for the limits, as you put it, Eric, the limits of free speech themselves and the splits that result from such a high raised political debate would themselves have some political efficacy. right? So it's not a matter of like consensus or not a consensus. It's a matter of like provoking that the limits themselves to have a kind of political meaning and momentum. And so with that, Ed, your closing remarks?
Yeah, I suppose mainly just to address the question that was raised, I agree with Ben that sectarianism is a symptom of a lack of meaningful organization. I think that has been true historically and would remain true for any future socialist movement or party. I agree also, especially with the importance of a culture of open and discussion and debate in socialist organizations. Interestingly, Max Shachtman's tendency actually emphasized this in breaking from mainline Trotskyism. And Shachtman also questioned the necessity of founding the Third International, especially given the Third International's effect in splitting American socialism. And this was a theme also picked up by historians of American socialism like James Weinstein and Jack Ross. So that's, I think, a deep question that gets touched on here. And I agree with Eric that the SP expulsions of the Socialist Party expulsions of pro-war socialists were justified. I think it's often forgotten that Debs actually supported the fact of there being some split-offs from the party during the party's early years. He's often portrayed as a unity at all costs type of figure, but there were socialists with whom he disagreed and who split off. And especially in the early years, he took part in that and didn't necessarily see that as a bad thing. And I think Shachtman and Draper both recover a similar spirit in Lenin, that Lenin viewed splits as potentially cultivating a healthy and desirable, one might even say liberal atmosphere of multiple socialist parties or tendencies involved in organizing a wider movement for proletarian socialism. And again, that task of organizing is key because that's what would prevent a multiplicity of parties, I think, potentially operating in that atmosphere from simply devolving into sectarianism. And so obviously free speech, both within parties and among parties would be central to that outcome.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you to everyone for joining us for this panel, especially to our panelists for taking the time to come out here from across the world in this case. And once again, if you would like to be included in our emailing list, I will drop in the chat right now. If you are interested in getting involved in Platypus activities, this is the place to go. Or you can find more about Platypus at platypus1917.org. So thank you, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.